What a wonderful turnout. So, welcome, bem-vindos e bem-vindas. My name is João Bill. I'm a faculty in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. It is a great joy to have you all here today for this event organized by the Anthropology Department and the Brazil Lab and co-sponsored by the Humanities Council, the Princeton Environmental Institute, and the Program in Latin American Studies. Many thanks to Patty Lieb and Carol Dobb for their extraordinary help in making this happen. To talk, we will soon hear from the wonderful Brazilian anthropologist Carlos Fausto on the poetics of an Amazonian world, followed by comments by the ever thought-provoking Rob Nixon. Is the opening of a two-day workshop on Amazonian poetics that our dear colleagues Pedro Meira Monteiro and Marília Librandi from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, together with Carlos, concocted and organized. And it's a follow-up of a pilot event in Rio de Janeiro at the Instituto Moreira Salles last June. We are delighted to welcome an incredible group of artists and scholars from Brazil working in and on the Amazon, including the visionary indigenous artist Jaider Esbel and the Nilson Baniwa, who are sitting there. Thank you for being here. Right. And Jaider, who actually made the image for the poster of the event, brought some of his original work. Right? And so if you want to touch base with him, talk, to look at his artwork afterwards, feel free to reach out to Jaider and also talk to the Nilson. You know, that's the purpose of this event. We want to enlarge our sense of the arts and the humanities, of the social sciences, and their role into this question of planetary, not just survival, but existence and well-being. So before introducing Carlos and Rob, I want to say one more thing. This event is part of the Amazonian Poetics event, the two-day feast with scholars and artists from Brazil, and including our own graduate students. We hope will create networks and conversations with graduate students as well from Museu Nacional, from Rio de Janeiro. It's part of an ongoing collaboration between the Brazil Lab, the Anthropology Department, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, with the Social Anthropology Program of Brazil's Museu Nacional, one of Latin America's oldest and most important scientific and cultural institutions, which was destroyed tragically by fire last fall. With the leading help of Christy Henry, who is here with us today from Princeton University Press. Where's Christy? At the back there, right? With her help and the help of Fernando Acosta Rodriguez from Firestone, the librarian for Latin America, Princeton was able to rise to the occasion and collaborate with our wonderful colleagues, like Federico Neuberg is here, and Carlos Fausto, Aparecida Vilaça, and other colleagues from the Museu Nacional in relief efforts, and especially on the reconstruction of Brazil's principal anthropology library, the Francisca Keller Library. And it has truly been a remarkable collaboration, and to see how our colleagues, rose from the ashes, literally, and chose as their main project of reconstruction a library, and the role that Princeton University Press, Princeton University, and other academic presses, more than 100 academic presses, were able to help. And given the great support of the relief efforts, they actually got more space for their new library, Carlos told us today. So warm congratulations, Carlos, Federico, and your colleagues for your extraordinary work in keep going what is certainly the most important anthropological institution in Latin America. So with funds from the Provost Office and the Center for Human Values, we are now organizing, following up this initial reconstructive collaboration, relief efforts, new academic initiatives between Princeton and Museu Nacional faculty and graduate students aimed at intellectual cross-fertilization. So what you are witnessing here, this event is the opening of something that we want to continue for at least 3 years, and we have the resources to make that happen. So we will keep you posted on those events. So now, to our speaker. Carlos Fausto is professor of anthropology at the Museu Nacional at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has been conducting fieldwork among Amazonian indigenous peoples since the 80s and writing on warfare, shamanism, ritual art, mythology, and political authority. He's the author of Warfare and Shamanism in Amazonia and co-editor of Time and Memory in Indigenous Amazonia. An incredibly talented and wonderful visual anthropologist, Carlos has also co-directed, together with Takuma Kuikuru and Leonardo Setti, the powerful film As Hipermulheres, The Hyper Woman, an extraordinary film that documents an all-woman festival held by the Kuikuru tribe from Brazil. Carlos's new book is titled Art Effects, Image, Agency, and Ritual in Amazonia. It's up to be out soon. Okay. So thank you, Carlos. Let's give Carlos a warm, warm welcome. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, great. And joining Carlos today is Rob Nixon, the Thomas A. and Curry C. Barron Family Professor in Humanities and the Environment at Princeton University, where Rob teaches creative nonfiction and environmental studies. Rob is the author of numerous award-winning books, most recently Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, a seminal, a must-read book, a seminal contribution to the creation of the environmental humanities field. Rob is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, where he writes on environmentalism and on literature and culture from the Global South. His writing has also appeared in multiple outlets, such as The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, The Guardian, The Nation, the London Review of Books. Rob Nixon started out as an activist and socially engaged writer working on the overthrow of the apartheid system in South Africa. He has since focused on environmentalism and public writing, particularly in relation to struggles for environmental justice in the Global South. It's a great honor and pleasure to welcome this distinguished speaker and discussant to our session on the Amazonia, the Poetics of an Amazonian World. So let's give now both together a warm welcome and applause. Great. So the format is simple. Carlos will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will hear comments from Rob and a few questions, and then we'll open up to the public, and that's our start. Let's go.
Thank you. Hi, hello. Can you hear me well? Good. So, hello. It's a great pleasure and great honor to be here, to talk to you, to be invited to be here. And I would like really to thank the Department of Anthropology and the Brazil Lab, especially my friends João and Pedro Meira Monteiro, who are here. I feel so much at home at the Brazil Lab just after a year or less than that of contact that I will present an entirely exploratory talk. It's a sort of a responsibility of my part, but I'll take the risk. I want to elaborate on an Amazonian aesthetics that expresses itself through a regime of small intervals, producing variation by means of minimal differences. My hypothesis is that this aesthetics is not only foundation of Amazonian indigenous visual and verbal music art, but also the way Amazonian people perceive and engage with the world. I know this is a rather bold claim, and I cannot prove it. All I can do is try to make it look more plausible for you. And my point of departure today are the discussions we held last June during our first workshop in Rio. I came out from it with a couple of questions, to wit. What is it about Amazonia that makes it appear so impenetrable to the outside eyes? Why is Amazonian often described as confusing and bewildering, monotonous and in disarray? Is it only about its nature or also about its cultures? Is it just a shortcoming of non-indigenous eyes, or do these tropes tell us something about Amazonian worlds in themselves? So let me start with some examples of these common misunderstandings about Amazonian. I began with a quotation from Euclides da Cunha's On the Margins of History, where he writes, "On the flip side of admiration or enthusiasm, what usually surprises us in front of the Amazon is rather a disappointment. It is, without a doubt, the largest painting on earth, but it is flatly rebated on a horizontal plane. And since it lacks the vertical line preeminent in the movement of the landscape, in a few hours, the observer gives in to the fatigues of unbearable monotony and feels that his sight inexplicably is shortened in the endlessness of those empty and indefinite horizons like those of the seas." This image of an Amazonian nature as unbearably monotonous is less common than the classic tropes which emphasize the grandiose splendor or its hellish character. The monotony here condemns the forest and the river to non-signification and invisibility. Neither green hell nor paradise, the vegetation becomes a meaningless background. Monotony is here associated with the lack of proper distinction between discrete elements. And such a feature was also frequently attributed to indigenous cultural expressions. In the last decade of the 19th century, the German ethnographer Hermann Mayer reached the upper Xingu River, where he encountered a rich mask tradition. He was puzzled, though, by the fact that it was rather, I quote, difficult to decide to what extent these masks describe the human body or an immortal animal. Mayer touches here on a recurrent European difficulty in the analysis of Amerindian iconography: what to make of the apparent confusion produced by the admixture of animal and human forms. Such supposed lack of distinction is also commonly attributed to Amazonian indigenous music. The following example was brought to my attention by Pedro Meira Monteiro. In the 1930s, Mário de Andrade had the opportunity of listening to indigenous songs recorded by Roquete Pinto 20 years earlier. And I'll briefly play it for you.
É o fonograma 14.600 do Museu Nacional, copiado no Instituto Nacional do Cinema Educativo. Canto dos Índios Nambiquara, da Serra do Norte, publicado na Rondônia.
And here is how Mário de Andrade describes his experience. At first contact, one feels completely depatriated. This is because the main characteristic of the way of singing of our Indians consists of a constant oscillation in the sounds universally used. The singing evolves by approximation of these recognizable sounds entirely involved in a confusing nasalization, systematically employing dragged portamenti, voluntary indecisions of intonation, a true sound mist, within which the profile of the melody hardly stands out. The image conveyed by Mário is that of a musical haze, a poorly discernible melodic contour which comes close to and distances itself from sounds universally used. Although Mário felt himself depatriated, he had a good ear and a large musical repertoire, which permitted him to characterize somewhat positively the phonograms he listened to. This was not the case of the anthropologist Robert Murphy. The case of the anthropologist Robert Murphy, who did fieldwork among the Munduruku in the 1950s. And here is how he described the music of their sacred flutes. I quote, "The actual music produced by the three flute players was not recorded and can be described only as a deep and rather monotonous dirge. The music is always the same." Murphy's characterization of Munduruku music echoes colonial descriptions of the sacred flutes of the Arawak, whose sound was often depicted as a gloomy, mournful noise. Unfortunately, Murphy made no recordings. After all, the music was always the same. I do not want to nag at Murphy 70 years later. From hindsight, it's too easy to criticize. I myself confess that having spent an entire week recording the Cuicuro Sacred Flute songs in 2006, I was barely able to distinguish one piece from the other. I was aware that not everything was the same, yet everything seemed the same to me. My sensation was one of being exposed to a homogeneous sonic mass, which I was unable to discriminate and memorize. My perceptual difficulty contained, though, an important clue about the differences between the structure of variation in Cuicuro music and in the music to which I was accustomed. I had the same experience, visual, not auditory, while hunting with the Paracanã in the dance forest in the 1980s. There I saw nothing. Everything was reduced to a monotonous sequence of shades of green and brown. To see something, I needed new eyes sensitive to a world of chromatic microtransitions within the green-brown spectrum. I never developed it. I imagine that many fellow anthropologists have had similar experience during fieldwork, not only on walking through the forest or listening to music, but also on trying to distinguish basketry patterns or, say, varieties of manioc. So my claim is that to understand these aesthetics, it's necessary to grasp how diversity is produced through a certain logic of variation in small intervals. Well, no one was more concerned with this topic than Lévi-Strauss in the Mythologique. So let me give you some background on it, knowing that this is an old and venerable subject that only Amazonianists still care about. Next section is called Discretely Continuous. For Lévi-Strauss, etiological myths tell us the story of the passage from a continuous state associated with nature to a discontinuous one in which culture emerges. This is not done once and for all, since, as he puts it, and I quote, "The fluidity of experience tends constantly to escape through the meshes of the net that mythical thought has cast on it. Not only life as such puts the requirement of discontinuity at risk, the ritual also poses a challenge to myth, since it endeavors to reverse the latter's work. And it does so by closing gaps and nourishing, and I quote again Lévi-Strauss, the illusion that it is possible to rewind the myth and remake the continuous from the discontinuous. How does ritual operate in order to rewind the work of mythical thought? For Lévi-Strauss, it draws on two main operations, fragmentation and repetition. The ritual fragments actions to infinity, attributing difference to minimal nuances, and it repeats them endlessly in such a way that differences that have become infinitesimal tend to merge into a quasi-infinity. And I think Lévi-Strauss was quite right in his characterization of ritual. The seriousness of any ritual resides in the fact that they produce more than as-if metaphorical states. The ritual reconfigures the world, installing a game in which, as Bateson says, the discrimination between map and territory is always liable to break down, and the ritual blows of peacemaking are always liable to be mistaken for the real blows of combat. But such conflation is only a limit case. Rituals are oriented towards producing asymptotic identifications, where an infinitesimal distance is always preserved between the prop and the prototype, the map and the territory. In other words, rituals do produce a quasi-identity and a quasi-continuity, but the asymptotic line never intersects the curve. My contention here is that Amazonian indigenous aesthetics in general plays with this very limit, approaching it by constantly creating variation through minimal difference. But how, then, is change produced in this case? As you know, for Lévi-Strauss, transformation is an essential feature of mythical thought. It is not, however, to be misconceived as a flux in the model of becoming. Transformation for him is about clear-cut relations. The changes are topological transformations within which the relations remain constant. But what happens when we start thinking about variation as minimal increments, small dislocations in which the discrete approximates the continuous? I would say that my model is neither one of continuous flux nor discrete change, but in a sense both. I'm looking at how variation produces minimal intervals, intervals that tend to be so small as to create the image and the potentiality of a continuity. This is why our eyes and our ears are so badly prepared to understand Amazonian worlds. Where we see monotony, sameness, confusion, there lies a principle of variation with the highly structuring function. In a sense, Lévi-Strauss taxonomized too much la pensée sauvage in an effort for granting scientific legitimacy to it. From the viewpoint of our new ecological-oriented sciences, however, connection and context are more important than classification. We shall thus value indigenous knowledge exactly for its capacity of traversing our clear-cut categories. But, of course, this is another and long story, and I'll turn now to some ethnographic examples of what I'm trying to say. Next section is called Quasi-Continuous Ornaments. The Nambiquara live in a transitional zone between the savanna of central Brazil and the Amazonian rainforest. In the 1930s, both Mário de Andrade and Lévi-Strauss had contact with their culture, the former by listening to phonograms of their music, the latter during his famous expedition to the Serra do Norte. The Nambiquara provides us with one of the best concrete images of the production of minimal intervals between discrete units. And here are some necklaces. The ones I chose to show you here are those made solely of black tucum beads. The Nambiquara consider them as their most precious ornaments. And they particularly prize those whose beads are so finely cut that they look as if they were a single black thread and not a set of lined-up micro-units. Nambiquara necklaces also play on the dialectics of interiority and exteriority. The small beads are lined up by means of an unbroken cotton thread. And peoples are made in the same way. For the Nambiquara to be seen as kin, one has to be adorned with black necklaces. This is the visual counterpart of an invisible whitish line that dwells within the person. Predatory spirits constantly try to steal this internal line and replace it by their dark lines, thus capturing the person who becomes ill. The only way to revert this process is to extract the dark line and insert a new whitish line into the patient. And that is exactly what Nambiquara shamans do. And here lies a nice little perspectivist detail. Shamans do not see this internal cotton line as such. What they see is a beautiful black tucum necklace. The internal line and the external beads differ in a way. Tucum beads are very small, discrete units that, when lined up, give the impression of being a continuous black lines, whereas the white line is a continuous indivisible. That is why it serves as a material model of the soul, which for the Nambiquara is an indivisible, thus lacking smaller parts. Similar mechanisms, albeit diverse in their formal procedures, may be found in basketry making. And one good example is that of the bicolor flat baskets of the Equana people studied by David Goose. And here are 3 examples of them. The first is Worotosakedi, the evil demiurge's face painted. The second is Maroferi, the jaguar's face. And the last one is Awidi, the coral snake. As Gas demonstrates, from the base pattern Worotosakedi, those other drawings are generated. through the addition of new elements of the same nature. There is no plastic rupture, but a repetition of motives that produces variation. This mechanism allows to distinguish patterns from each other, and at the same time, it brings them together in a series in which all share the same predatory essence of the base drawing. Each pattern is a transformation of the other through an addition or subtraction of a small element already contained in the previous pattern. The point about this form of variation by incremental changes is that different patterns participate in each other's beings. The variation in small intervals produces an underlying continuity, a sort of resonance between the evil demiurge, the jaguar, and the snake. In a sense, they are all the same, but at the same time, they are not. Next section is called Repetition and Variation, Take 1. These examples are, in a little sense, ornaments to my argument. In order to make my case, I still need to expand the domains to which it applies. So let me now address verbal art, focusing on repetition with variation, which is another way of talking about parallelism, a poetic and mnemonic technique that characterizes oral literature in general. And I turn now to the Kuikuro, a Carib-speaking people who are part of the multi-ethnic and plurilingual constellation of the Upper Xingu, where I do field work nowadays. Let me take a couple of examples from the narrative on the origin of the pequi fruit, which tells the story of how the pequi tree sprouted from the dead body of Hyper Cayman, who had been killed by a man for making sex with his 2 wives. The following sentences describe Cayman, whose personal name is Sakagatu, as he emerges from the lake while the women collect manioc. There, in that place, when they were pulling out manioc roots, when they were harvesting it, he found them. He came. Cayman arrived when they were pulling out manioc roots. Wow! The coming of Sakagatu, his necklace, his nail shell necklace, his armbands, his earrings, just beautiful. This is Siri here. I'm controlling the time with the iPhone. Here, we have a series of snapshots of 2 parallel actions, one repetitive, the women pulling manioc out, the other revelatory, with Cayman being metonymically revealed through his ornaments. In the following passage, repetition with syntactic variation describes the passage of time from the burial of Cayman's body to the sprouting of fruit trees from his body. The rain fell. The rain fell. It rained again. It rained again. When it had already rained a lot, they went to see. When it was already a tree full of sprouts, here, 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 it was growing up. Although I love this myth, I cannot continue to analyze it here for lack of time. Let me just note that when seen from the perspective of this parallelistic structure, a mythical narrative such as this one, from which Lévi-Strauss would extract the discrete unities of his analysis, is in fact constructed by means of variation at minimum distance, a form that fills the gaps between elements and produces more or less continuous displacements. This is even more clear when it comes to more formalized verbal genres such as spells. Let me show now how this works in the spell that opens the pequi fruit season among the Kuikuro. This spell is composed of a number of macro blocks, each of which has standard formulas that vary in 2 ways. Some contain a slot where the names of different characters are inserted in a sequential order. Others vary according to the mythical action of each character. Macroblock 1 starts with the main characters of the mythic narratives, the Cayman, his two lovers, and Marika, the betrayed man. I can do it, but I'm not going to do it. But I can. If I have time, I had time, I would try. But this is the chapter.
Ho, 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 ho. Hega tintiga dai tanago ke tahinga kwego. Olenga puha te huga te tanago ke. Ho, ho. Hega tintiga dai tanago ke kamisa kago. Hanging kinga poita di tatu ko te kena kai tanago ke.
So it runs the translation. By your name, I call you Hyper Cayman. For having become like this, I call you. By your name, I call you Kangisakago. For having had sex with him together with your younger sister, I call you. By your name, I call you Tanumakalu. For having had sex with him together with your elder sister, I call you. By your name, I call you Marika. For having killed him, I call you. So you see the structure of repetition and variation, and the slots are filled in by names that appear in a mythical narrative. So you have an indexing of different genre. Yeah. So I don't need to point here to the obvious procedure of repetition and variation, well known by most of you as a poetic device. Let me just add that the whole spell is constructed this way, but with different personas, since it does not only tell the myth in another form, but also includes technical and ecological knowledge associated with the Piqui season. In other words, we have a sort of ecology of memory in which contents are stored and retrieved by means of an indexing system that crosses different domains and cultural expressions. Now, the next section is called Musical Heights. So I'll come back to music where the notion of interval has a precise meaning. And as we saw before, a common observation of non-indigenous listeners on Amazonian or Amerindian music is that it is monotonous. So allow me to talk briefly about Kuikuro instrumental music, more specifically about their sacred flutes called karutu, whose sight is prohibited to women. The sacred flutes repertoire is the largest existing in the Upper Xingu. In our documentation project, we registered 18 suites, adding up to more than 500 different songs in total. The suites are indexed to a particular moment of the day or night, a specific ritual space, and a certain choreographic trajectory. Each suite contains a certain number of musical pieces, which must be executed in a strict linear sequence, which the Kuikuro represent as a string with notes. Karutu flutes have 4 holes, which give us 4 intervals between 5 notes, with the approximate distance of 1 tone, 1 semitone, and 1 semitone. So between the highest and the lowest note, the distance is only 3 tones. So let us briefly listen to an execution. Nilsson and Jaide liked it. So, but I told you about 4 wholes and 5 notes, but many suites do not employ all the 5 available notes. So, for instance, in a highly esteemed suite called Itzaengo, inside it, only 4 notes are played. The lowest one, though, occurs only in the accompaniment performed by the 2 accompanying flutists. The highest note, for its part, is only employed by the soloist when he plays the variations. In other words, a great part of Itzaengo's music is built from just 2 notes and 1 interval of a semitone. So no wonder they sound repetitive to my ears. But for the ears of indigenous musicians, they are at the same time similar and quite distinct, respecting strict principles of variation. The Kwikuru make a crucial distinction between what they call the base and the ramification. All the pieces of the same suite have a similar base, hence we know that they are part of the same set. But each one of them has its own ramification or ramifications that individualizes it within a linear sequence. These variations are marked by longer phrases played with a dilation of rhythm, values, and tempo. For the Kwikuru, these are the really important parts of the songs. In my conversations with Giancarlo, this man over there, a great flute player, he used to explain that, differently from the whites, they do not like to use large intervals. An idea he would exemplify by imitating Brazilian country music singers with their 2 voices, normally 1 octave apart. He would also know that they do not employ too many variations in a single piece. 1 or 2 is enough, maximum 4. The ethnomusicologist Acácio Piedade, who worked with the Waujá people of the Upper Xingu as well, analyzed with much greater technical competence than me the structure of their flute music. He came to the general conclusion that reiteration to the slightest difference is, among the Waujá, a general aesthetic and cosmological principle, further suggesting that it is, and I quote, an orientation in the vision of how to constitute difference in the world, a phrase that I can only enthusiastically endorse. So let me go back to Lévi-Strauss in order to move forward. And this is called The Wild and the Cultivated. In an article published in the 50s titled The Use of Wild Plants in Tropical South America, Lévi-Strauss noted that, and I quote, "It's not always easy to distinguish between wild and cultivated plants in South America, for there are many intermediate stages between the utilization of plants in their wild state and their true cultivation." Many recent studies on plant domestication in the Amazon showed that Lévi-Strauss was right. The leading specialist on the subject, Charles Clement, points to the existence of 52 crops with domestic populations, 41 with semi-domestic populations, and 45 with incipiently domesticated populations in Amazonia. One may ask if these categories represent different stages of a universal linear process of domestication or points to a different mode of relating to plants and the environment. And if the latter is the case, how do we characterize this specific mode? I will not remake here the argument Eduardo Neves and I made in a recent article on the subject. For now, I just want to suggest that this mode can also be understood as part of a more general statics of small intervals. As an example, let me bring the Pequi back to the scene. Here is the Pequi. Upper Xingu people are expert fruit tree cultivators. Old manioc Swedens are transformed in beautiful Pequi orchards that remain productive for almost a century. Every Xinguano village is surrounded by these groves, which function as important territorial marks for the people who planted them. From a botanical point of view, the Pequi of the Xingu presents many evidences of the so-called domestication syndrome. When compared to its wild progenitor, Carioca brasiliensis, the fruits of the planted varieties are bigger and sweeter. There is also a spineless variety, which has recently attracted commercial interest. The Cuicuro themselves distinguish clear between their cultivated pequi, over there, and the wild progenitor, although they are both of the same species. However, they do not care much about internally differentiating the planted varieties. True, there are names distinguishing kinds of pequi, but these are not clear-cut categories based on a single classificatory principle. According to the origin myth, from the navel of the hypercaiman, the tree first sprouted, the tree that first sprouted was the one that gives the largest fruits, all the other kinds being ramifications of this original trunk. And in fact, the Cuicuro plant the seeds of different varieties mixed together in their home gardens and then transport the seedlings to their swidens, with no concern about what kind of pequi they are growing. They say they only really know which kind they have planted when the tree bears fruit. When one looks at a pequi grove, one sees a homogeneous orchard, which, however, contains an unsuspected variability, which cannot be captured by clear-cut categories. If domestication was only a question of time, we could not explain the Cuicuro nonchalant attitude towards stabilizing varieties. Why do they not plant, for instance, orchards with only the spineless variety, or clearly separate each variety in different well-tended groves? Of course, these questions are very common in the colonial literature about Amazonian planting techniques. Well, what I'm trying to suggest here is that this aesthetics of small intervals also applies to certain aspects of Amazonian indigenous agriculture. I know this is harder to swallow, but I want to take the risk and stretch my idea to other domains. So allow me now to talk about the most Amazonian of all producers, manioc. Okay. Repetition and variation, take two. Manioc is a fascinating plant. Differently from the pequi, it was consistently domesticated some 10,000 years ago in southwestern Amazonia. The varieties initially cultivated were probably low in hydrocyanic acid, while the bitter varieties, which today predominate in central and eastern Amazonia, would have been selected later. Manioc is the only staple food I know whose varieties were positively selected for their poison. Manioc is vegetatively propagated by humans. Manioc is vegetatively propagated by humans. People do not plant the seeds, but the stem cuttings. The daughter plant is thus a perfect clone of the mother plant, making very easy to stabilize land races. The genus Manihot counts with 98 different wild species in neotropical areas, but only one species cultivated in Amazonia, Manioc esculenta crans. There are, though, thousands of varieties of these species in the region. If propagation by stem cuttings results in complete identity between parent and offspring, and the offspring plants, how is it possible that so many varieties exist? The trick is to keep a bridge, an opening. Amazonian indigenous people neither control nor inhibit the sexual reproduction of manioc plants. They just let it happen, experimenting with new varieties that emerge from cross-pollination. The horticulture of manioc combines thus mechanisms of closure and opening, repetition and variation. Take two. Among the Cuicuro, for instance, there are about 40 different terms designating varieties of bitter manioc. Most of them are names of fish, since the origin myth tells that each variety was brought by a different species of fish. We have here a classification that reminds Lévi-Strauss' redefinition of totemism as a homology between two discontinuous series, one social, the other natural. In the case of the Kuikuru, the myth establishes a correlation between intraspecific varieties of manioc and interspecific varieties of fish. But again, the mechanism of variation occurs at short distances. One species, many varieties. Looking from afar, Kuikuru manioc fields seem a homogeneous vegetal mass. But as we approach it and sharpen our eyes, we see a diversity of leaf shapes, branching heights, node distance, stem, and fruit colors. Amazonian indigenous people are mostly interested in the micro difference below the species level. The gradations of color from green to yellow, the scale of textures from smooth to rough, the gradient of consistency from softness to hardness, thus creating an unstable compromise between the diatonic and the chromatic, in other words, a sort of minimalist diatonism. So last section is called the open. So to conclude, let me better elaborate this idea of the open, this bridge that promotes diversification and slows down entropy. I'm not referring here to Agamben's book, The Open, but once more to Lévi-Strauss, particularly to his notion of the opening to the other, with which he defined a general orientation of Amerindian societies towards alterity rather than identity. This orientation would promote a recurrent outside-inside movement in which life is created through the incorporation and preservation of difference. The statics of variation at short intervals may help us to eliminate the paradoxical way in which we, Amazonianists inspired by Lévi-Strauss, ended up using this notion of opening to the other. The paradox consists in the fact that we have embraced, at the same time, openness and repetition, transformation and permanence. How to accommodate a vigorous movement towards difference with a recurrent repetition of basic structuring principles? How can the hot outward movement give way to the supposed code character of Amazonian indigenous societies? Borrowing Deleuze's words apropos the eternal return, we could say that our play of reiteration and differentiation is, and I quote him, at once both production of repetition on the basis of difference and selection of difference on the basis of repetition. And if in fact repetition implies difference, it becomes possible to conceptualize social processes in which repetition and alteration are not mutually exclusive, at least when operating at short intervals. The opening would work as an anti-entropic mechanism, but would not imply jumps, just displacements. Historical changes would be the accumulated effect of a way of repeating under variation and vary under repetition, giving us an impression of stasis. However, rather than homeostasis, we'd be facing a sort of allostasis, which implies a more dynamic balance. If we go back to our somewhat outdated discussion on the historicity of Amazonian indigenous peoples, these would translate as the way they change is different from the way we conceptualize change. Just as our ears have to adapt to distinguish variation in indigenous music, our eyes have to adapt to see variation in indigenous history. We could say of the latter, indigenous history, what we have said about indigenous music. I quote, "This mode of constructing difference by means of repetition and variation produces a temporality that is not in the order of linear or teleological development, but rather displacement, which is made of advances, setbacks, and stops. Perhaps a true sound missed, but only for our untrained ears." Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carlos, for that tremendously provoking and wide-ranging and conceptually suggestive but very, very economical talk. In responding to a talk on a regime of small differences, I should begin with a very large difference, which is that I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a specialist in the Amazon, and I have no formal training in visual culture. So I think in inviting me to respond, João was testing the boundaries of my imposter syndrome. Nonetheless, as somebody passionately interested in both aesthetics and ecology, I found a lot that's very provoking and reorienting, especially in your talk, Carlos. And so the terms that I will tease out a little bit more, and I hope that we can discuss these further in the group, are repetition, variation, classification, and monotony, which are at the core of this particular talk. And in thinking about the variation of minor differences, I think, Carlos, you've hit upon an approach that is simultaneously aesthetic and ecological. And so it brought to mind, as you were talking, Amiri Baraka's definition of culture as the changing same. And I think the same is true of an ecosystem, the changing same. In neither case can you approach them as an arrested phenomenon, as static. There is an energy transfer, there is mutation involved at the same time as we have powerful forces invested in cultural preservation and ecological preservation. And in both cases, there are judgments from inside a system and outside the system as to what is being preserved. And what is being preserved is a statement and an investment in the value of a particular moment within that transformation. So that is one question we could think about a little bit, is this the judgments regarding stasis and continuity and movement in relation to judgments about what is unacceptable or deviant, and how that can affect both the futures of ecosystems and the futures of cultural forms. And in the early part of my career, I worked in African languages, and one of my most powerful and early memories connects very much with what you were saying about auditory and visual incompetence, the struggle to see differences the way the performer is seeing differences. And this was in the context of the indigenous Xhosa people in South Africa, who was listening to ritual oral performances of verbal narratives. And initially, before I heard them live, they were classified in a book. These are variations of this performance, these are variations of this performance. And the idea was that the story was the same, but a strong performer would ring the changes on that sameness. And what I found relative to the people inside the culture that I spoke to and the performers themselves was that I was incompetent at judging the markers of creativity, exactly in this relationship to difference and variation. And so I was sort of schooled in a more, broadly speaking, Western tradition of iconoclastic creativity. In other words, the mark of imagination or the mark of creativity were flourishes of vast difference. And what interested me and left a deep impression on me was that with the Xhosa oral performers, they saw a lack of repetition as a failure of creativity. And so they had a very different idea of monotony, and an excessive deviation was a failure of imagination. And that was something I struggled to get a handle on at the time. And similarly, because stories mutated and sometimes blended, what in the textbook, before I had heard the live performers, what in the textbook were classified as examples of sameness and difference were not, did not correspond to the performers' ideas of sameness and difference. So they would say, oh, that story doesn't belong there, it belongs here. And I couldn't, through my outsider's ears and eyes, I couldn't read a classificatory system that could make sense in those terms. I was fascinated by the term ecology of memory, and I would love to hear more about how you figure that. And I want to say also just a few thoughts on the question of landscape monotony and aesthetic monotony, and the extent to which, perhaps particularly with colonial observers coming in, how the one might bleed into the other. And you mentioned the da Cunha at the beginning, and the horror of the horizontal and the absence of the sublime. And that has profound implications for the way cultures are valued and the way landscapes are valued. And even if we think in the United States, when the national park system was developed, the idea of a sensational landscape was very much connected to the vertical. And so the last ecosystems to have designated national parks were wetlands and prairies. So the Everglades was very late, and similarly the prairie, the recognition of prairie as ecologically and aesthetically valuable was belated for that very reason. And even if we think of popular diction like President Trump's talking about drain the swamp, one person's swamp is another person's wetland. But the drain the swamp still contains that negative horror of the horizontal, the idea of the valuelessness of the ecosystem, which in some circumstances spills over into a negative designation of the cultures that depend on that ecosystem. So I was very struck by the idea of the idea of developing new eyes and new ears, and also within that, the acknowledgement of incompetence and failure and the thwarting of that discriminatory acumen that's required to read and hear those intervals of difference as measures of continuity and creativity. And just a final thought, which is that with regard to this idea of the changing same, what happens to that when the pressures of accelerated change, both ecological and cultural, are brought to bear on that culture and on that ecosystem? And so if we accept that all ecosystems are changing all the time, at what point is there a judgment that the acceleration of those changes is excessive and non-normative and requires an intervention? And similarly with cultural forms, at what point in an endangered cultural environment are there pressures for that may result in different permutations of different intervals of small difference that in some sense are affected by an aura of embattlement. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
It's wonderful, thought-provoking presentation, wonderful comments. And we can move this here. So if we speak loud enough from here, can you hear well in the back? Okay, great. So Carlos, do you want to respond to the question of acceleration? I think that's I could see many people nodding. The question of the judgment question of accelerated times, and I think it resonates with what we are experiencing, ecologically in our minds.
Okay. Well, I think it's the most important question, although I would like, if I have time, to address two other points that you made. First of all, during about 20 years, I've been working with history and change and write a lot about it, and also I have a kind of discussion about indigenous people deliberating change in concrete empirical situations. So what I'm moving now is to another scale, which implies, of course, this sort of aesthetic ecological thinking. It's super exploratory. I'm still trying to guess in which kind of swamp or wetland that I'm walking on. And this is one of the questions that I will have to face soon. And it is important because it is accelerating now. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's the only time in indigenous history that it did accelerate. Probably during the Inca Empire in the Andes, in pre-Columbian times, there was an acceleration as well. So we should not think only that our society or our culture promote accelerations. I think there are phenomena, pre-Columbian ones, that are also accelerated, and we have to understand that. But nowadays, really, is a moment of acceleration in many senses, including the ecological one. And we are trying to work as activists to face it. But I don't think I do have at this point, a reflection, a solid reflection about it. I think it's probably one of the most important questions by now. But of course, if you have ideas, I would be certainly glad to hear and try to enter in conversation.
So what we will do now is we will collect bundles of questions. Right? So hopefully with many variations. So bundles of questions. So for the sake of getting the most voices and variations, right, available in this short constrained space-time. So I would encourage you to be brief and condensed. Let's try to exercise the art of condensation. So if we could collect like 4 or 5, brief comments or questions, and then we will turn it to Carlos and Rob to respond, and then we'll get a next round. Yeah. So let's collect a few people. Yes.
Very quick. In summary, you say that your eyes can't see their variations. What did they say about your music?
Okay.
Yes, please. Yes. Yes.
Hi, I'd like to know, you were talking about monotony or perceived monotony, and also the idea of slight variations in a continuum that is segmented or fragmented in really small pieces. No? So I was wondering, I think it has to do with the question the other person asked, how much is that the perception of an outsider, and how much this perception is shared by the producers of the culture, right? If we don't see as much variation as they see, if they think about reality as a continuum that is fragmented by culture. I don't know, I was just wondering about the people's perception.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Marilia?
I would like to hear a little bit about the incantatory aspect of these repetitions and small variations, so kind of the ritualistic incantatory aspect of that.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and then in the back, yes?
This is a question that as an archaeologist, I'm frequently very interested in thinking about Amazonia as an analytical unit, the possibilities and the problems that that poses. But I just wonder if you might say a little bit about the sameness and variation across Amazonia as an analytical unit. We hear a lot, particularly for non-Amazonians, about Amazonia writ large, and I wondered if how you're thinking about that sameness and variation across the basin.
Okay, let's go.
Um,
And prepare for the second round.
Okay. Okay. Let me try to exercise our conversation. What they say about our music. Well, there is a power relation embedded here. I mean, they are listening to. They are very open to the other, first of all. So they are listening to every kind of music all the time, and they are pretty open to behave us as fans of, country music or wherever, depending on your age. Usually youngsters, they like it, and old guys, they don't like it. But of course, it's completely asymmetric. So, I mean, it's like, who knows, during the Roman Empire, being some part of France, and you be listening to Roman music, but perhaps the Romans would think that all they were singing in France was a barbaric, non-significant form of music. So what I was just trying to say that is there is a power aspect to it, which is I see when I try to talk about our incompetence of understanding it, is also a way of putting it in terms of reversing the power relations. So, and it's something that started, in a sense, in February here, when I was invited to comment Lily's talk, and I started organizing these ideas of how to revert. You remember the map, so and try to talk positively about many aspects of Amazonia that are either negatively talked or put in as a counter discourse to our world, like in clusters against the state, which is, and I'm a bit against againstology, because you againstology is you define the parameters from our society to the other. So I was trying what kind of understanding, positive understanding and phrasing of it that I could offer in this case. So this is about the first question. People's perception. Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult in terms of ethnographic elicitation to really understand visual and auditory perception of your interlocutors. You basically have, I mean, just asking questions is not enough. But I have worked a lot, I mean, many hours with, especially with this guy, but I mean, not this guy, Giacarlo and other song masters. And I think I'm pretty confident that I'm describing well the way they understand their music. So, well, that's it. And third question, well, the incantatory aspect of the ritual. Well, this is a bit the discussion I make in my book on how this approximation to continuity is a form of creating a sort of, I wouldn't say incantatory, but a sort of space-time that is outside the mundane and the ordinary. And in the case of the flutes, there are many elements to it. Repetition is fundamental, and it's the continuity of the accompaniment in a sort of beat effect, because you have a slight, how do you say that in English? It's like trying to, in Portuguese, too many languages, dephasing or something like that of the accompaniment and the soloist, creating a sort of beat which comes from nowhere. It's like, this kind of music that, like in Corse and Sardinia and in Siberia, different procedures, but that creates like a third voice or a second voice, or that was not expected to be there. So, absolutely. Amazonia. Well, look, it depends on what you want to do. Since I have worked in two different areas of Amazonia with two very different peoples, one was basically hunter and gatherers, very warlike, with practically no objects. And then I went to this Kwikuru people where you have lots of objects, artifacts, and hierarchy. The others were totally egalitarians. These are very sedentary as well. So Amazonia is a huge and immense region. It's the size of continental US, about that. So it's really huge. It's difficult to talk about Amazonia in general. But if you don't put this in these terms, you can't make a general argument. So it is a heuristic procedure, which I'm totally conscious that then we have to fragment it and show the differences and different regions, different cultures, different linguistics, etc.
Let's get ready for the second round, but Rob, you going to add something?
No, this is fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so Brian, right, and then Jamiri, Pedro, yes.
So you talked about, a mode of temporality that also sort of operates in terms of small distinctions, and a mode of perception that operates with small distinctions. Could you expand on whether, if at all, this has an effect on how events are narrated or recognized or partitioned from one another in narrative or what we might call historical telling?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so Jamiri?
I was thinking of Rafael Menezes Bastos' discussion of music as a translation machine in the Xinguano system and the Kamayoran, particularly, and this idea of the intersemiotic chain of ritual. And I was just wondering if those suggestions that he has made at that point resonate with some of what you have been trying to develop with Bruno and the ones of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carlos, thank you. It was a beautiful talk, beautiful comments. I'm curious about velocity or speed as both a poetic and political tool, because in order to listen to those small intervals, it seems that we need to change completely velocity vis-a-vis this, right? So would you elaborate on that? I was thinking about actually Amri Baraka's idea of the changing same. I mean, when exactly can you realize that the changing same is changing? In other words, I mean, there is a moment in which you are close to that change that is too subtle, and that subtlety seems to be probably something that we are needing in our world nowadays. So would you elaborate on that velocity and small intervals?
Yeah. So maybe following that, and then you can bring Rob into conversation too, because you ended with the stark memorial here of the indigenous leader who was assassinated just a week ago, right? And when we were walking today, we were talking yesterday after you arrived, you were saying, okay, Belo Monte, the infrastructure, the big dam, you know, it says, what it brought was death. Right?
Yeah.
Altamira, the city where you also worked, and Xingu is the city with the highest rates of homicide in Brazil, which are already incredibly high throughout the country. And, so this memorization, I would like to find some resonances with your talk. Are you talking about a certain ethics, a certain politics in that aesthetics, right? I would like to tease that out a little bit more. And I know that you have been so playing such important roles in the rights of indigenous peoples, which are so threatened in Brazil right now, and you know, from the 80s, the constitution that granted these rights, you know, very, progressive constitution. Now they're under threat. So how do you see? You know, it's not that it has to be. I don't want to come up, you know, forcing you to be normative here or to normatize that aesthetic. But how do you see the implications for ethical and political thought of that aesthetics?
Okay. Shall I?
Yes.
Okay.
And then, Rob, just please.
You want to start?
You go.
Okay. So I think there are two questions that involves temporality in different ways. First, I will fragment Amazonia. The Kuikuru people and the Paracanan people, they have a totally different ecology of memory, and I can talk later about this. Kuikuru people, their narrative structure is always in parallelistic style, and it is always about a space and time that is not historical. And they distinguish clearly a time when we were old spirits and a time when we became people. Humans. The Paracanan people, in their side, they are completely different. They are completely evenemential in the French sense. They will, if you ask them, why do you do that? They say, well, someone did that in the past. Oh, I remember my uncle, he used it to do that. So you're not going to get, the kind of response that anthropologists think are universal, because our progenitors, our forebears did that forever, because in the old times of, our cultural heroes, it was like that. No, not at all. They are totally evenemential, and they talk about events all the time. I discussed that in a sense. But this doesn't mean that event and time that they are using, we can call it historical, but it's not the same as the way we conceived it. Of course, saying this is very easy. Showing this is very complicated. I think I showed that in my book, but so I will not rehearse the whole argument, which I don't remember as well. So many years ago. So that's the first point about temporality. But in the case of the Kuikuru, this is clearly so. I was astonished when I started working there, because they are procedural. If you ask a question, they will detail all the procedures, especially ritual procedures. They do rituals all the time. So completely different kind of people. So Amazonia is very much different when you look from inside. But there is a different velocity, a different speed in any case, I think. And this is, I think, something you have to learn. And freshmen, anthropologists going to the field, this is the first thing you have to learn. It's another time frame. And if you don't understand that, people will not accept you. It's about relations. Relations take time, and they are subtle. And they're not, they are a product of time, of long time. You have to prove that you were there for a long time. So this makes a lot of a difference. And I think this is part of kind of general approach to daily life. But what I'm talking about, and when I talk about temporality, it was I was trying to actually to let you make it clear. I had to write this a couple of months ago an article to the fast-rift of Philippe Descola, and there is an article about that he wrote published in 1994 called "Homeostasis of Productive Forces in the Amazon," which for me I had always a problem with that, because I was much more like in history, and there was hot days of history and agency, etc. But then I started to think about it, and I came to understand something that I didn't grasp at that time, and this is something that I'm trying to convey here as well. The last part of because we have always talked about change and transformation, but there was also a paradoxical thing about it. So how you bring these two things together and make them work without being too structuralist in the sense of it's always the same. You just repeat it, and not being like teleologically minded, that things are all the time changing in a certain direction. So that's a way of talking about it in a different form, which is different, is what Rob understood immediately, is a way that combines ecology and aesthetics. And if you see, I'm talking about the forest as part of it, and not in the terms of that there's the forest and they become like this. There is aesthetic of the forest that is part of this aesthetic of cultural aesthetics. And it's part of a general ecology. Of course, this has a political and ethical implication. But I'm trying to give a positive form to it without being normative. Because people will, it's just because it's my reflection, I'm thinking about that, I can't help it. It's just like when you start thinking, you can't help it and you can avoid it. But I don't want to be normative, because when you were normative, you were immediately in a certain side, and you can't talk to other people. And you're not going to convince other people of these ideas. So I don't know. Trying to.
Yeah, sure. No, I thought this is all very, very compelling. As we were talking about this, I was thinking of Dipesh Chakrabarty reflections on the Anthropocene, and saying that for a long time, at least in the West, the study of social history and environmental history were separate domains, and now they're implicated and entangled in such a way that narrative cannot be segregated, and it's a long way from being identical to this situation, but it is perhaps an avenue of approach, that the cosmological and the ecological and the historical are intertwined in a certain way, and you're not forced to choose an emphasis. And I think that is that does allow a point of connection for some of this. The other thought I had was about two other thoughts. One was Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, talking about the limitations of the realist novel and the idea of landscape as background for individuated characters as actors, and his return to the epic as offering a set of aesthetic forms that are perhaps more amenable to the Anthropocene in the sense of cosmological scales, where gods and beings and other than human life forms have agency and are historical actors in some sense. And then the third thought I had was just about the forest guardians and the cascade of environmental martyrs. And thinking of the term guardians and the term stewardship and the degree to which this also, in some quarters, will bring up assumptions of stasis, that you're protecting what is, as opposed to a dynamic relationship where you're intervening and making choices from outside and inside the culture about value and how that value is reflected in the cultural forms and in the ecological modes, in a way.
Just no. First, I want to come back, but about Rafael Menezes Bastos, the last quotation. In fact, I cut is citation of Rafael because it would be like too many embeddings to say in oral discourse. But of course, it's totally influenced by Rafael and his students, mainly Acacio, but others as well. So it's.
Let's go for one more round of questions. So we have Luke, Vinicius, yes.
I think well, first, thank you.
Welcome.
And I think at some point you noted a distinction between the notion of allostasis and becoming. And it's my understanding that, perhaps misunderstanding that for Veros de Castro, in drawing the link between Deleuze and Lévi-Strauss, the notion of becoming is very important for that rereading. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the distinction between becoming and allostasis.
Good, thank you. Vinicius?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was thinking also, well, with Lévi-Strauss during the talk, and I was thinking about the first chapter of The Savage Mind, and I guess that the way that I remember that book is that he departs from aesthetics, because he's talking about this piece of wooden sculpted art, and talking about the difference between that and engineering. And throughout the book, he goes from aesthetics and indigenous aesthetics to indigenous thought, or to savage thought, as he calls it. And the way that I understood your talk is that you do a little bit of the inverse. You come from a way of thinking of continuity and discontinuity, and you arrive at an aesthetic. And I wanted to ask you to say what that does to, in which way that this inversion affects the system, or what is being done.
Yeah. Thank you for the translation. I was wondering about whether it might not be appropriate to some extent to risk a slightly more normative attitude from the one that you seem to feel comfortable with. What I have in mind is this, when the kind of recognition of and respect for variety is applied to ecology and diversity in agriculture, it has very good effects. It respects and preserves a diversity that otherwise would be lost of different kinds of, say, manure or other kinds of domestic plants, and that's a very valuable upshot. And it seems to me that there's something attractive and valuable in the kind of sensibility, right, that has the effect of protecting the diversity. And so it seems to me that there's something there that it's appropriate to take a normative attitude towards.
Yes, please. Just a quick note on the colleague's comment. Thank you for your presentation. So to me, this also relates to how it seems that my comment is going to be as exploratory as your talk.
Okay.
It seems that they have apprehended the way that nature solves the problem of averting entropy by creating diversity and different life forms to cope with the transformations in the world. And I think this also relates to how the timing problem comes, because if this rate of change is too fast, nature will not be able to cope with the change and will not be able to develop strategies to survive. And in that sense, you said in your talk that the indigenous peoples, they try to avert entropy by creating diversity. So to what extent do you think that this changes will allow them to continue this strategy.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, please. Excellent.
In the poem you showed,
Little bit closer.
in the poem that you showed, the device that's being used is repetition with syntactic variation.
Mhm.
And you said there are different personas. And I'm wondering also, are there different vocalities and voicings? And in fact of that, is it also a production of different stories or memories embedded in the same poem? And perhaps what are the politics of that is quite implicit?
That's great. Okay. Well, these are wonderful comments and questions. Good. Let's go.
Yeah, okay. Well, in a sense, there is a connection between to risk a more normative attitude and your question, your exploratory idea, which I agree entirely about the description. It is about that. And I don't do this here because, first, a great friend of us and a venerable professor of us, Manuela Carneiro da Cunha, has been writing a lot and defending it, and we are part of the same band. And I just wrote a report on this subject for a larger report that she organized, trying to make some minds in the political world to convince people the importance of diversity and the role indigenous people play in promoting diversity. So it's part of this argument. The opening is that, and so I think I can be more normative, but in other publications. And I'm also part of, I coordinate in among the Kuikuru a project for documenting and recuperating manioc varieties that are, sort of disappearing in a faster pace than we should expect, because disappearance is normal. You don't think they're in fact, manioc varieties, after some time, they lose their productivity, so new types, new land races are important, so because of entropy. So it's also about agriculture, and not only agriculture, but what we talk in Amazonia about agroforestry, so trying to understand the whole system. And I think I'm moving also, the thing about talking about manioc, picky fruit, spells, mythical narratives in the same, it's a little bit crazy, but that's the whole idea. And I was also impressed by, reading and teaching Eduardo Cahn's book, How the Forests Think, which was very important to try to understand from another perspective what could be a forest for indigenous people. I think he got something there. So the two of them, then Levi-Strauss and Eduardo, and so then we start a psychoanalytic moment of the talk, because these are the guys who formed me, and as you know, you always have problems with your fathers, in plural, and then when you get old, you start to reconcile. So this is incredible, because I wrote, this is the most, I'm sure that Virginia will notice that, is my most Levi-Straussian piece in my whole life. I came to know him quite well in the past, but now I'm so reconciling and thinking. And the crazy thing is to present this thing in Princeton, where it was in this Institute of Advanced Studies, Gertz used it to work. So in a very anti-Levi-Straussian moment. So, so I'm thinking along with Levi-Strauss this time, in a sense, also against him, but with him, but doing what I think Eduardo and Descola, Philippe,
Eduardo Oliveira de
Castro, I'm sorry, Daddy.
Brazilians refer to the first name.
Viveiros de Castro and Descola, their project in the 80s and 90s was to explore the internal limits of Lévi-Strauss thinking. So, but then, in a sense, through Deleuze, Eduardo moved beyond Lévi-Strauss, and Philippe Descola, he sort of came back to a model which is more akin to the structures of the elementary structures of kinship in his 2005 book. So, what I'm trying here is not to jump immediately in these models, but trying to discuss with them. So the notion of becoming, I just say, oh, I don't think this is the delusion becoming, but the repetition, difference and repetition is something that I use much more. So it's more in this sense. The homeostasis and allostasis care. Allostasis is a concept from medicine, from the medical sciences, but it could be employed to ecology as well. It's a more dynamic kind of stasis. It can be a metaphor, but it must be discussed more technically, be more technically precise. It's full of uses of mathematics as well in a very risky way. So, I don't know. This is why I said it was very exploratory. As the Savage Mind, I will have to reread it, but in a sense, yes, but because the Savage Mind, I think, was a very incredible book. But Lévi-Strauss was, in a sense, taxonomizing, as I say, too much indigenous thinking. Taxonomy was basically what science was about in the moment. And I think that's what I say, in ecological minded or oriented sciences of today, we can think differently, but still because the questions are there. So I don't know if I answered it, but...
Yes, so I just want to respond to this beautifully put question here about entropy and acceleration and identity. And so one of the things that you've seen in the field of ecology is certain scholars saying we are too focused on loss and negativity, and you have terms coming in like emergent ecologies, novel ecologies, chance ecologies, so and a sort of suspicion of the idea of invasive species and so forth. And in the context of cultural forms, so in that context we have, for instance, centers for the study of rapid evolution. And you might have a center for the study of not rapid enough evolution. That would be a complementary center. But if we move from the ecosystem and to the cultural forms, you know, there is in many quarters a celebration of hybridization. Okay, and so when is the hybridization regarded as a devouring parasite from within, and when is it regarded as a constructive novel ecosystem of aesthetics in a way? So I think it's operating in both forms. Yeah.
So we are approaching the end of this part of the event. We will continue. We have a wonderful reception that Patty prepared side. So we want you guys to stick around to talk to each other, to engage with our artists in residence for a few days here in Princeton, you know, and talk among yourselves, but also engage with Carlos and Ron. And to say that tomorrow, the Amazonian Poetics Workshop, Poéticas Amazônicas, will start around 10 a.m. Julie's Roman Rabinovitz at 1:44. So you're invited, there will be lunch there. It's going to be in Portuguese, but during the pauses, if you don't speak Portuguese, don't speak Spanish, stop by for the meals, to talk to our guests, you know. But we really hope that we will see many of you there tomorrow. And if you want to learn other languages, this might be the place to be. But guys, before we depart, this was a feast. manioc, flutes, magnetization, right? We really are deeply grateful for Carlos, for Rob, for these wonderful presentations, comments, and probing questions that we will carry with us. Thank you all for being here. And thank you.